I am here right now with Kyle Claussen, the CEO of Resolve. Those of you in the Facebook group, I hope he is no stranger to you. He's been sponsoring the White Coat Investor now for quite some time, and we've sent lots of White Coat investors to Resolve to help with contract negotiations and other needs that they had. And it's been wonderful to have his support because it's a real need among doctors who too often do not get their contracts reviewed and end up regretting that decision. There's nothing worse than getting in a job, finding out you hate the job, and then finding out you can't get out of the job or have some sort of major penalty to get out of the job. And the way you avoid that, of course, is to have that contract reviewed so you know exactly what it says before you get into it. So today we are going through a whole bunch of questions that you guys have, as well as common questions that Kyle gets and that I get about contracts. So let's go through some of these, shall we? Let's just roll from the top with these questions, and we will answer the ones we have. If you would like us to answer your question, though, just leave it as a comment under the stream here, and we'll answer your questions live right here during this presentation. So let's take on our first one here. Let's start with this one. That's a real hot topic, especially now during the COVID pandemic, where it seems like physician burnout that was bad before has gone through the roof. Let's talk about the connection between physician burnout and physician employment agreements. How are they related? How can they affect each other? Let's talk about that to start with.
Yeah, I think that's a great one to start with because it's very timely. So you mentioned physician burnout's been there for, forever probably, but it certainly has increased. And I do think that a lot of the reasons for the recent burnout over the last maybe 5 or 10 years, not just 1 year, has a lot to do with the fact that most physicians now are employed. A decade ago, they weren't, there weren't these massive health systems or insurance, companies that are employing them. And so now I think the statistics are somewhere around 70% are employed. And so when you become employed, you're giving up control as part of that, which makes your employment contract much more important probably than it was a decade ago. And so when we review these, and I'm sure you get these questions in the group fairly frequently too, it's, the reasons people leave aren't usually because of money. It's not usually a dollar amount. It's usually because all of a sudden they're taking more call than they thought they were going to, or that they, got moved to a satellite location that they didn't think they were going to be driving to 1 day a week. And so most contracts are going to start out with blanketed language that's very protective of the employer and very flexible for the employer, which makes sense. Their counsel drafted it for them. That's what they want. But I do think that causes a lot of heartburn, and it causes a lot of, situations where people get frustrated. They can't get the support staff they need, right? If you need a scribe or if you need somebody else to help you be efficient. And if your duties and responsibilities are changing as part of that, and I think we saw a lot of that during COVID, right? People rightfully so helping, right, in areas that they maybe didn't typically, but also the question is could they be forced to do that? If your contract doesn't detail what your scope of work is, if it doesn't detail when you're supposed to work, where you're supposed to work, I think a lot of that contributes to burnout. Aside from the fact that, all health systems and all private equity, I mean, they have goals of making profit and driving revenue. And so you're certainly seeing some physician comp compressed as well, I think, which we can get into and talk about. But I do think they're directly related. I think your contract usually is not going to start out protecting you. And so if it doesn't, and then you have a change in circumstance, that can certainly lead to burnout.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And for those who are just coming on, there's about 26 of you on right now, and there'll be, hundreds more watching this later when it's not live. Welcome. We're talking with Kyle Claussen of Resolve. Resolve is a company that helps doctors with their physician contract negotiations, physician contract review. He's been a longtime sponsor of the WCI Facebook group. I hope this isn't your first time hearing about him or from him, because he's been sponsoring the group for months now. But be aware that WCIers, white coat investors, those of you here in the group, you get 10% off Resolve services if you use the code WCI10. So you can check that out. Whitecoatinvestor.com/resolve is the easiest URL to remember that will take you right there. and we'll make sure we keep that connected to the best place for you to land on the Resolve website. But we're just answering your questions today, questions we've already received, and questions that you're typing in now as we have this Facebook Live. Just a Q&A session today about physician contracts and contract review. All right. This is another area that I see a question on very frequently. Everyone wonders what's negotiable? What can you really do? What are the areas of a contract which can be adjusted?
Yeah, my default answer is everything's negotiable, right? To some extent. There are certain parts of the contract that you usually can't touch, but those are few and far between. And so the things that you usually won't be able to adjust are things like health insurance, 401k plans, right? I mean, these are group benefits that they don't change on a one-off basis for somebody coming in, unless you're in a very small group. If you're, joining with someone as a partner and it's just two of you, potentially you have the option to change those things. Outside of the large group benefits, pretty much everything is up for discussion, in my opinion. And the areas that we see most commonly addressed, compensation certainly one of them, which would include everything from your base salary to your production levels and bonuses to vacation, time off, maternity leave if you need that, and beyond just the comp, the job itself, what you're doing for schedule, what your support staff looks like. We have equipment requests sometimes if they don't have the things that you need to do your job well, where we've seen that included. So the answer is broad and it's overarching, but it's pretty much everything in my mind is up for negotiation. It just depends on what's important to you.
Let's talk about a related question, and let's take this from one of the people watching here live, from Dan Katz. He's asking, for a first contract out of residency or fellowship, how much leverage do we really have? I don't have much experience at that point, but don't want to get a bad contract. I guess the question is maybe how aggressive can you be? Has that changed since COVID? Is it the same as it's always been? Talk to us
Yeah,
about that.
in my mind, it hasn't changed much. There's still a shortage the last time I checked of physicians. And so if you have multiple offers, right, and you're not just absolutely set on going to a location, if you have 2 or 3 offers in the same geographic area, there's no reason you shouldn't push. You as a new grad, right, people always think that they bring less value to the table, and that there may be some short term, truth to that. But the last time I checked, when you submit to insurance, it doesn't ask you how long you've been in practice. You're just submitting codes and they're being reimbursed for that. So you can drive the same amount of value as someone who's been there for 10 years if you can be as efficient as they can. So I would say that, yes, you have leverage. Again, if you can have multiple offers, if you can have a reason to push and not be scared of losing out on the job.
Thank you for your question, Dan. I hope that answered it. Let's take this one from Beverly while we're at it. It's from Beverly Chang. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm hoping the T is silent. She asks, whom should you be negotiating with? The division chief, the department chair, an MD, or an administrator? I suppose it should be the first person that they put in front of you, or is that really just like a sham negotiator, or who should you be negotiating with?
It's good. Well, it's going to depend. I think that references to a lot of academic titles there. So it depends on who they put you in touch with. If there's an administrator, if there's a contract person, right, that has the role of handling all those things, that's a decent place to go to from an administrative side. Usually, it's the person that you've interviewed with, right? Whoever has the control to make the changes. So a division chief or a department chair certainly would be helpful in that, but even sometimes they lack the full authority, right, to make compensation changes or things of that nature. So start with whoever gave you the contract. They'll put you into the right, person's hands. And as long as your positions don't change, it doesn't really matter if it's a sham negotiation or not. If you're if you're sticking to your guns and advocating for what's important to you.
Yeah. What should you do if you're halfway through a negotiation and you realize that the decision maker is not the person you're talking to? Is it appropriate to ask to talk to the decision maker, or are you just forced to play the telephone game?
No, I think I would. If they're coming back to you with responses of, well, I need to go check, right, constantly, or I can't give you that answer on the phone, I would say, for the next call, for efficiency's sake, right, let's have the conversation with whoever can make these decisions, because you don't want to get strung out, right, and neither do they. I mean, they want to get through negotiation quickly too. So it's to both parties' benefit to have the parties talking, whoever can make those calls.
Good tip. All right, we got another question here from somebody here on the live component. Thank you, David, for your question. He's asking, should there be an inflation component built in? I totally understand the question. Inflation's now at 5.39%, I think, according to CPI. Lots of people thinking about inflation these days. Should you try to build that into your compensation somehow? Should they be offering it? Or what if they don't? What are your thoughts on some sort of inflation component in the contract?
Yeah, I think inflation is one component. I think there's also an argument to be made for just the changes in reimbursement and fair market value. And so I think you should always have some idea of when you're going to renegotiate. We do see cost of living adjustments built into contracts occasionally, where it's 3, 4, 5% that would kick in. We also see references to fair market value and MGMA and other surveys that if for some reason the data jumps quite a bit, which happens from time to time, that their base salary, their production numbers will jump to meet the current value. So I think it can be inflation or it can just be a change, right, in the data that's out there. And the answer is yes on both of those, because what happens on the employer side is that as soon as the fee schedule changes, right, they're going to come to you with an amendment and say, hey, we can no longer pay you this because something happened. And so you should have the same expectation back if it's a fair relationship, that you want to be paid fairly year 2, year 3, as inflation creeps up.
Good answer. All right. So here's a question that came in previously. And it's one that I think a lot of people have. We have this fixation on bad things, I think. And so we like to, focus on those. Those are the most clickbaity titles on any blog for sure. But what are the most common red flags in a contract? What is something you see that really lets you know you need to do some negotiating, you need contract review, you need to see what you can do to change this? What are the red flags you should know about?
There's a handful. The first one would be anytime that there's a reference to allowing them the ability to change the contract or change your comp plan without giving you proper notice or without giving you time to negotiate or reevaluate. That for me is number one. The second one would be any type of restriction on what you can do post termination and any potential penalty clauses. So most states, and we can talk about this in more detail too, but most states still allow non-competes to be in place. Some don't, but they're exchanging a non-compete for a liquidated damages type penalty that if you leave within a certain amount of time that you've got to pay 6 figures plus to them. And so it's an effective non-compete because nobody wants to pay that amount. So if numbers can change first and foremost without your notice or without any type of communication from them, that's a huge red flag. If you're going into private practice and there's some type of partnership component being offered, I also think it's a concern if they're not offering financials for you to take a look at. You need to know what you're going to be getting into, right, in a partnership type setting. And so those are the two that come to mind most frequently around numbers.
It's interesting that they're different when you're going to be an employee versus going to be an owner. They are different red flags for sure, and two different contracts. And oftentimes it's kind of awkward because you start as an employee. You come into the partnership track, and maybe they don't want to reveal all their financials to you yet. Because partnerships 2 years down the road. Kind of an awkward conversation, I suppose. I think most of the people that have joined my group, that's kind of the situation. And we've made some vague references, but I don't think we've ever opened our books to when we hired a pre-partner.
Correct.
Usually within a year of them getting there, it's all kind of open book, and we know they're going to make partner in another year, and no big deal. But do you recommend someone join a pre-partnership track without seeing the books? Is that crazy?
Well, I think you want to have some idea of what the partnership is going to return to you, because here's the reason for it, is that most partnership tracks come with the position that we don't pay as much as an employed position, right? Because there's this carrot at the end. And so for me to evaluate if I'm the physician joining it, whether or not that carrot is worth it, I have to know something about the numbers. If not, I'm potentially losing 2, 3, 4 years of income on faith that this group is going to take care of me. And with all the private equity right now, I mean, you may not get to partner. They may sell out before you reach that partnership track. So not all groups will do it, and your group might be one of them that doesn't kick out the financials early on. And I completely understand that from the ownership side. But I do think if you're evaluating 2 or 3 offers and 2 of the practices are showing you financials and one's not, that to me is a distinction that's worth thinking about.
Yeah, I think maybe we just get away with it because we're in Salt Lake, and people are so desperate to get a job in Salt Lake that they'll
That
take
mountain back.
anything, no matter
Yeah.
what we pay. Yeah. All right, let's take another question from a live viewer. This one comes from Prakash. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I apologize, Dr. Nalani, if I am not. Who asks, at what point do you try negotiating? Is it after receiving an offer letter or the actual contract? I understand there's about a 1 to 2 week time frame to respond when a contract is sent. What do you think? How would you answer that one?
I think as soon as you have anything in front of you with terms on it, that's the time to negotiate it. Because if you sign off on a letter of intent, even if it's non-binding, which a lot of them are non-binding, they'll even say that, in the letter. It's very difficult to get people to change their mind once you've said yes to 200,000 or whatever the number is. If you come back and say, "Oh, sorry, right, I hadn't looked at MGMA yet, and I actually want 250," that sours the relationship pretty quick. And so I think I would say as soon as you have any number in front of you, whether it's an official LOI or a text message or however they present it to you now, you want to do it early on.
Yeah, I mean, in reality, the negotiation started with your first contact. When you
Right.
looked at their website, the negotiation done. When you go there for an interview, the negotiation's already begun. So really, the whole process is a negotiation. So I would feel like you're negotiating from the very beginning. I think, but certainly by the time you're talking about specific terms. All right, this next one comes from one of the live watchers, viewers, I guess is the word. David is asking, are quality incentive metrics common in all contracts, or are they required by CMS or another regulatory body?
They are becoming more common. They are not in every single contract. And I would be surprised if you see them. If you have 2 or 3 offers, I'd be shocked if you see them in every contract. They do vary, and every institution has different values on, or different categories on how they're going to track the quality incentive. There's no requirement that I'm aware of to have them built into the contract itself. And so we're certainly not seeing that as the majority rule at this point. I would say, I don't have a statistic directly, but my gut says about 30% of the contracts that we see have some type of quality built in, and the others are all either just pure base or base with some type of production, component to them.
Hmm. Another question from Dr. Chang. How do you ask your employer to adjust for the cost of living if you're taking a job in New York or LA, et cetera?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, and maybe you know this about physician compensation, or maybe you don't, but unfortunately, the areas that are most expensive to live in tend to pay the smaller amounts. So I think you can certainly ask for that and advocate for that, but the data doesn't support asking for higher comp in those areas. So the 2 areas of the country that reimburse the highest are the Midwest and the South. West Coast and the East Coast are lower, and so I think what you just mentioned about Salt Lake, about how everybody wants to be there, that has supply and demand effects. If they have 5 or 6 candidates coming through that all want to be in San Diego or in Salt Lake, they don't have to pay as much as they do in the middle of Iowa, right, or Kansas or somewhere. So I think you can try, but I think your best bet is again to have multiple offers that you're looking at.
Yeah, it's always the best negotiating tactic is another job you're willing to take if they don't match it or
Right.
beat it. Yeah.
Right.
All right. For those who are just joining us, I'm talking with Kyle Claussen of Resolve. They do physician contract reviews, physician negotiating, or contract negotiating. And if you are coming out of residency, or you are changing jobs, or you're considering a partnership, get your contract reviewed, and Kyle can help you do that. We're answering your questions. We're answering questions that were previously submitted and trying to get you the information you need to be in a position of power when you go into your negotiation. All right, the next question we have is, how do I know if I am being paid fairly?
Yep, you need to know what fair market value is. And so that can mean a couple different things. That can mean competing offers, like we just referenced. That's your best data source. You can also look at MGMA, Sullivan and Cotter, some of these other large national comp surveys to get an idea of what's fair. You can also look at internal data like we have. If you're hiring somebody to review your contract, they should have some comparables for you as well to look at. So those 3 things would be the easiest for you to come across. If it's a public institution, sometimes they'll have their data mandated that it's public. My experience with that is that they don't they don't necessarily show all the production numbers and things like that in an academic setting. So it's not really a true marker of what fair market value is. And you're not going to find out what they're paying for production. It's just going to be a total number at the end of the year. So by and large, I mean, MGMA is the one that we see referenced in contracts most often. That's what these health systems are going to utilize in an audit as well, if they have to prove that they're not paying above fair market value. So I think you need to go in with the same ammunition or the same data points that the employer is going to use.
Now, I'm not familiar with, is it Sullivan and Cotter, you said?
Correct.
Is that free data, or do you have to pay for that like you do MGMA data?
That is that's a competitor, I would say, of MGMA. So that's another paid source. Yeah.
So if somebody wants that data, I mean, that's $800 or something, right? To sign up for
I think it's more than that. Yeah, I think it's actually
Yeah.
less expensive to have somebody review your contract and get it that way than it is to buy a bulk purchase.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yep.
I occasionally see people offering to share MGMA data, and I caution them to be, maybe you don't want to do that. That's basically stealing their product. And I imagine they're going to come down pretty hard if they catch you doing that.
There's a copyright and a license on that, and you should not do that. But I know what happens.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. All right, let's take another question here. This one is, how do I negotiate if an employer tells me this is their standard contract? Those famous words that everybody uses, it seems like.
Yep. Almost every employer will tell you that. So that's not going to be a unique response from them. It's not true in almost every situation. So even the largest of the employers out there will move on things like compensation or things that are going to be deal breakers for you, and you may have to push them to that point. I mean, you may have to tell them, I'm not taking it unless this thing changes, but we see it all the time. So again, knowing what they've worked on in the past, and it's easier for us maybe sometimes to say, okay, well, Bob, you changed this 2 months ago for the last person we talked on, but also having competing offers, again, that's your best source of leverage. So you should always negotiate.
Now, of the clients that come to you to, get some help with a contract, what percentage do you just review their contract and talk to them about it? And what percentage do you actually become the negotiator?
Yeah, most of the clients that come to us want us to help with negotiation in some form or fashion. So I would say it's, again, I don't have the number in front of me, but I would say that over half we're actually talking with the employers for them. Sometimes it's phone call, sometimes it's email, sometimes it's a group conference call, but it's certainly becoming more common, and I think that's because of the trend towards employment. Honestly, if you're in private practice, you want to talk to the doctor, right, that you're going to work with. If you're going to work for large health system and it's some administrator, you don't really have that personal connection.
All right, let's take a next question here. This one comes from Paula, one of our moderators. Thank you for being a moderator, by the way, Paula. In transitioning from pure salary to RVU-based compensation, is there an average time for that transition? Is it common to be gradual, or is it a cliff transition? What's common?
Most places are going to give you a year or two to transition to production. So whether it's RVU or collection or gross charges, however they want to define it, they usually will give you 12 months to ramp up. In my experience, I don't actually see a need for pure production if the volume's there, right? Because you're going to cover it one way or the other. So whether they keep that base in place, as long as your threshold is fair and tied to the same rough percentile that your base is set at. So if your base is at the median and your production threshold's at the median, well, then that looks like a fair setup to me. So most common timeline would be 12 to 24 months, but certainly we see a lot of contracts that always have a base. There is no complete transition.
Thank you for your question, Dr. Archer. Let's take another one here. Let's talk about tail coverage. What is tail coverage?
So tail coverage. So malpractice insurance comes in different forms. If you're on a claims-made policy, which means the insurance covers any claim that comes in while you're employed there, when you leave employment and a claim comes in, that coverage is no longer in effect. And so you need to go out and purchase an extra policy to make sure you've got coverage for those claims that would come in post-termination. That's what tail means. That's what tail is. If you are on a occurrence-based policy, there's no need for tail. Or if you work for the government on the FTCA, there's no need for purchasing tail in those situations. But especially a lot of private practices will carry a claims-made policy because it's less expensive. And so knowing who pays for tail is certainly important. It can run, 20, 30,000 or more, depending on your specialty. And it's certainly an important value point.
Yeah, I remember when I first came to my group, it was a claims made policy, and I think the initial contract said I had to buy the tail. And we negotiated that. So if they fired me, they had to buy it. And if I quit, I had to buy it, which seemed fair to me at the time. But neither one of us actually knew what a tail cost. So I actually sent the doc I was negotiating with, who's still our managing partner, one of my partners now. I sent him back to find out what a tail cost, because literally neither one of us knew what it cost. And in my specialty at that time, which was 2010 emergency medicine in Utah, a tail was $55,000.
Yeah.
So it wasn't trivial at all. The cost of malpractice has come down since then. So it wouldn't surprise me if it was lower now. We're actually on an occurrence policy now, but it's not a small chunk of change for a new grad. If you find out you hate your job after 3 months, you might be paying back everything you made at that job as a tail. So it's definitely an important part of a contract. Let's talk about non-competes. You alluded to them earlier. Everyone always wonders, are non-competes really enforceable?
Yeah, the answer is the general rule is yes. So most states still allow them to be enforced if they're reasonable. And the problem is that finding out if it's reasonable or not is going to be an expensive process. And there's not a lot of case law on it, which is why there's so many questions, I think, about it. They're going to look at the time. So how long are they restricting you from practicing? The geographic area, how large is it? Also the scope of practice, what are they preventing you from doing? And each one of those has to pass a reasonableness test. We talked about some of the states that have said you can't have non-competes on physicians because it seems to go against public policy, which I would agree with. The employers are still trying to find ways around that by putting in liquidated damages clauses or putting in certain minimum years of practice, right, before those liquidated damages will disappear. So you need to look at them very carefully. You need to try to poke as many holes in them as possible. And ultimately you have to decide if the contract 3 months in, right, you're not happy with it. Are you willing to move outside of that area, or are you willing to fight it? Because fighting it's going to be expensive too.
Good tips. Good tips. All right. Let me see what we got here from viewers. All right. It's interesting, non-competes. Doctors hear about them and they're this evil thing, right? I view them from the other side now, right? I've been one of the owners in my partnership for a long time. I own a business here at the White Coat Investor. All my employees here at the White Coat Investor have a non-compete, and I wanted it to be as long as possible. Our attorney told us a year is probably about as far as we can get. And we made it very specific. I actually listed out the competitors they couldn't work for a year after leaving the White Coat Investor. It was interesting when I joined my group, I had a non-compete. And I asked, why do you have a non-compete? What's the big deal if I go work for another ER across town? It's not like people come to the ER looking for a specific doctor, right? They're coming in because they have an emergency. And really, me going over there isn't going to hurt your business one bit. And in the end, what they cared about was that I didn't steal the contract from the group, that I didn't start a competing group. So I said, well, if that's what you care about, let's rewrite the non-compete clause so that's the only thing that's in it. And so they had no problem whatsoever doing that. So really, obviously, if you're in plastic surgery or something, it's going to be a bigger deal of you stealing business from the person that's there. If you're in emergency medicine or hospitalist medicine or a radiologist, you really need to ask them why they have a non-compete at all. What are they really worried about? And chances are they will make it much less draconian if they really stop and think about why they care about a non-compete. All right. Our next question is about getting leverage. How can I get leverage to make the changes I want in a contract? And I think we're probably alluding with this question to your next best alternative, your BATNA in negotiation speak.
Yeah, so we've already talked about it a couple of times, but you have to know what your value is. So to understand if you have leverage, you need to know where their offer's coming in at, right? Because if they're offering you median or above, you may not need as much leverage because it's more of a fair offer at that point. But you referenced earlier, if you don't have an offer, you're willing to walk away, right, from this current one and go take job B. How hard are you willing to push it? And some people are willing to bluff, right, all the way to the end, even though they can't lose, their family would kill them. Most people are not that strong. And so to actually push as hard as they need to feel like they can walk away. So my recommendation is always as many competing offers in that city as you can get is to your benefit. And it's not that you're trying to necessarily string groups along, but you need to know what the market is, right? You need to see it with transparency and to know who's hiring and who's not, because it also may be the fact that you don't have leverage. The group might have leverage, and you need to know that. If they've got 10 applicants and you're one of 10, you might have to sign the contract quicker than you'd like to, and you might have to take terms that aren't beneficial, right? But if you're the only applicant that's been there in the last 4 years, you can probably push on some things. So get offers, get as many as you can.
Yeah, more information is good. That sort of information is gold in a negotiation. How many other people are interviewing for this position? That's a great question to ask, to know how much power you have.
Right.
For those who are just joining us, I'm talking with Kyle Claussen of Resolve. He does contract negotiations, does contract reviews. You can find more information at whitecoatinvestor.com/resolve. For heaven's sake, if you got a new contract, get it reviewed. Yes, it costs a few $100s, but you may save tens of thousands of dollars, and more importantly, a lot of hassle by doing so. This is one of those no-brainers in the personal finance space, especially your first one coming out of residency. Too many horror stories of docs who get into situations they don't want to be in and never should have really gotten in if they would have gotten that contract reviewed. All right, here's a question that came in earlier with one of the promotion posts we did about this presentation. How do you negotiate a salary when moving from one position to a similar position within the same hospital group? This doc sounds like he or she is moving from an ortho surgery position to a plastic surgery APP position. So this is a PA or an NP going from ortho to plastics within the same group. They're telling this APP that the salary has to stay the same regardless of your experience. What do you think? What would you tell this particular practitioner?
Yeah, I would tell them that the value, and MGMA does have data on APPs as well. So I would say, one, you need to know what the different specialties are paying. Reimbursement is not the same between ortho and plastics, right? So they don't make the same amount, nor does the business line generate the same amount of revenue. So it would make sense that you're bringing more value in one of those service lines than you are in the other. So regardless of years of experience, I think those would be the two arguments that I would try to make, is that the job is different, right? And so regardless of your licensing and your skills on that second area, you should be paid according to fair market value.
Okay. For those of you who are just joining, you can ask any questions you like. Just type them into the comments down there in the comments section, and we will get as many of your questions answered as we can. When we run out of questions, we stop talking and we go away. So make sure you get your questions asked before we finish. We'll be running short of the pre-submitted questions soon. But we have another one here from Dr. Archer. Some have said that it's illegal to ask others about their compensation. Is this true? For small specialties that aren't listed with the large informatics groups, how do you suggest getting this data?
It is not illegal to ask anyone for their comp data. Now, it may be a breach of contract on the person's part that would disclose it. I mean, there are times where there's confidentiality clauses and things like that are built in. But you can certainly ask the question. There's nothing wrong with that, and there's certainly no law. It's not criminal to even disclose your salary. I mean, it's just going to be a financial civil type penalty. So I think there's a lot of that happens. I mean, I think people do share information. That shouldn't be a shock to anyone. But I also think anything that I would get from a colleague, I would take with a grain of salt. I'd want to verify it myself, first, with the data. And so the second half of that, if there's not, if your specialty doesn't have much reported in these large surveys, I think you are going to need more context, right? Your specialty, society may have some resources for you on that. Services like ours may have internal data from other clients in your specialty, and the sample size is just going to be smaller, right? And that's the reason MGMA doesn't report. Is it's not that they don't have any data coming in; it's that they don't have enough to feel good about publishing it. So that's just the reality for those small specialties.
Yeah, good tips. All right, let's take the next question here. If doing a non-accredited fellowship, are there certain things to expect or protect against in a contract? We have discussed that there won't be a non-compete because the doc actually wants me to stay in the area. there
Yeah,
anything unusual about a non-accredited fellowship?
I would view it as very much as a part-time or a short-term job, right? It's almost like a locum position where you want to make sure you have control on everything that happens after that year or two, however long the fellowship is supposed to be, which would include, the non-compete for sure. It would include any type of non-solicitation clauses from, employees or patients that the practice would have. The malpractice insurance and tail coverage. You want to be very clear on what's happening there. So I think he or she is thinking about the right things, but you need to view that more as a short-term job than I would as necessarily a true, fellowship that's got kind of the standard accredited contract that would go with it.
Okay, fair enough. Okay. Can you negotiate within a year of your current job?
Yes, you can negotiate anytime you want, in my opinion, because we referenced this before, but the employers are going to do that, right? So when COVID happens and all of a sudden they need to cut comp and furlough physicians, they don't wait until your contract is up to do that. They're going to do it immediately. When fee schedules change, they're going to do it immediately or try to do it immediately. And so most contracts are going to have a termination without cause section in them that says this contract can be ended on 30, 60, 90 days notice, whatever the time frame is. That's your effective contract term. So if you have a 10-year contract with a 90-day out, it's really a 90-day contract. And so you can always, in my mind, renegotiate that because you're not stuck with them long term. Now you need to you need to know what happens if they say no. Are you actually going to turn in your termination because they don't change your comp or not? That's a secondary question.
Yeah, for sure. That's the way almost every contract, it seems like, in the medical world is. I mean, even our contract with the hospital is a 5-year contract, but both sides have a 90-day out. So it's just
Right.
a continually renewing 90-day contract.
Correct.
For those who want information about Resolve or interested in getting your contract reviewed, you can do that at whitecoatinvestor.com/resolve. If you've already clicked on that link or already gone to that link, note that I just changed the URL it goes to a more typical landing page, specially designed for white coat investors. All right, we're running out of questions here. So if you guys have some questions, make sure you add them here. Here's one from Mustafa Douadi. Hope I pronounced that right, Doc. How do you negotiate the RVU?
The same way you negotiate anything else in the comp package. So MGMA or all these other data sources have medians for the compensation to work RVU ratio. They'll also have a median for average production or average thresholds on the RVUs. And so depending on if you're on a base or a pure production model, all of that needs to equate to, if I produce at the median, am I earning the median? And if you're not, one of those levers needs to get pushed. It's either push up the dollar per RVU, drop the threshold, or increase my base. And so depending on your situation and what you want to have happen, if it's a high volume practice, your best answer is to push up the dollar per RVU, right? Because you can get through a lot. If it's a low volume practice, you may want more in the base. So use the data and decide which lever works best for you.
Here's another question similar to one we had earlier. This is kind of on the opposite end, though. The other question was, can you negotiate a contract within the first year? This one's, how many years should a typical contract last before attempting to renegotiate?
Most contracts are structured for 1 to 3 years. But that being said, they almost all have this termination without cause section that we talked about before too. So in my opinion, I would want to be up to speed, meaning I would want to be there for a full 12 months to know what my volumes are, to know how efficient I am, how many patients am I seeing, because at that point in time, you can accurately go back and say, okay, what I thought I was getting into was 4,000 work RVUs a year, and I thought it was fair, but I'm actually producing 6,000, right? And so it's time now to reevaluate this because it's not, it's no longer a fair setup. If you do it prior to that, I think it's difficult because they're going to say, well, it's coming yet, right? You're going to get more efficient. You're going to see more patients, and that may or may not be true. So it's harder to get that change to happen.
Okay, another question from David. Can you put a price on exclusivity?
Well, they don't usually put a price on it. I think it depends on what you want to do. So I think he's talking about side gigs, right? If you want to do moonlighting, if you want to do, locum work, consulting, you want to start a blog, all those things. Most contracts start out saying you can't do that unless they give you approval. And if you do it without their permission, they get to keep all the revenue from those things. So you can put a price tag on it, especially if you already have side gigs or other projects that you're working on, whatever the value of those things are. But I do think that's very case by case. Some physicians have no interest. One job is plenty. And some love to work on side projects. So, the value of that is going to depend on the person.
Okay. All right, our next question, another one from Dr. Nalani. And if you want to ask questions to Kyle or me, I suppose, get them in here. We're running out of questions here. And when we run out of questions, we end the Facebook Live. So this one's from Dr. Nalani. How is one able to leverage multiple contract offers when there is a limited time frame to respond to a specific contract?
Yeah, great question. So timing is really important. And we've talked about having 2 or 3 offers, but you also have to have 2 or 3 offers at the same time frame to use them. You can't have them spaced 3 or 4 months apart, right? So my recommendation would be to try to schedule all of your interviews roughly for the same time, so that way you're getting all of your offers at roughly the same time, so you can utilize them. If you have a place that's saying you've got 2 weeks, and after that we're going a different direction, you're going to need to decide if they actually have the other candidates to do that, or if they're bluffing. Most places are going to extend it because it's not true. Nothing disappears in 2 weeks usually. But again, if it's, I'll use San Diego. If San Diego is where you're going, that there's more likelihood there that they do have other people that want that job.
Yeah, I can speak about that from the employer perspective. If we've been waiting a week to hear from you since we sent you a contract, we're starting to get antsy. And we're like, why hasn't this person responded to us yet? And we're pretty likely to say we need an answer in 4, 5, 6, 7 days, and we mean it. We got other candidates for a job
Right.
in emergency medicine in Salt Lake, so they're not all bluffing. I'll tell you that.
Right.
We really
Yeah.
mean it when we give you a week. You got a week to accept it, but I mean, it's not the residency match for sure. Right.
Mhm.
There's some flexibility there. And if we really like somebody, maybe we give them a little more time. If we don't like you that much, then maybe we're going to go on to the next person. Just depends, I think.
Yep.
Okay, so I got another question here. People are really interested in non-competes, these restrictive covenants. We got 2 more questions about it. One of them's specific to Virginia. The other one is similar to the earlier question with a variation. Do you see non-compete clauses truly being enforceable for physicians in today's environment? I think we've answered that. But the interesting part about it is, what do you see being an enforceable penalty?
Okay, so I think the question about today's climate is that President Biden came out and said that he didn't want non-competes, right, to be enforceable, and he was encouraging, right, the FTC to act on that, but there's no mandate on that. So the rule as of today is that the state can do whatever they want, and most states still say that these are applicable and they can enforce them if they're reasonable. The second half of that, I think, is what's reasonable in my mind. That's going to depend on your specialty. It's going to depend on the location. If you're in a place like Dallas, 10 miles might be the right number. If you're in a place like, the middle of nowhere, Kansas or Iowa, 100 miles might be the right number, because what they're looking at is what does the practice have to protect? Is their draw area 2 miles like it is in New York, maybe, or is it 50 miles in Missouri? So uh, those things are case by case and even specialty by specialty on what they're going to enforce. You mentioned emergency medicine, anesthesia, emergency medicine, being a hospitalist, those are very different things than being a plastic surgeon or a dermatologist. And so there's no good way for me to answer that without knowing, what the specifics are around it.
Okay, so let's say you violate it. You got a 10-mile non-compete. It's a reasonable non-compete. It's 1 year. It's 10 miles. You decide you're going to violate it.
Mhm.
What's a reasonable penalty for that?
Well, so 2 options. They can get an injunction, usually, like a restraining order. They can prevent you from working.
Hmm.
They can file a claim against your next employer if the employer knew about it for tortious interference with the business. So your most employers want you to sign off that you don't have a non-compete. That's usually a clause of your contract. So that would put you in breach of 2 contracts at that point. And then the third thing is replacement costs or loss of revenue. So if you're stealing patients and they can show that they lost $200,000 of revenue from you doing that, that's what your penalty is going to be. If it's just purely that they had to recruit somebody else, or there's some type of locum cost that would go along with it, or recruiting costs that they wasted, those would be easily calculated as well. But the biggest one is loss of revenue, right? The worry about you stealing patients.
Hmm. All right, this the follow-on question might be too specific for you to answer off the cuff. This might actually need to be looked up. Do you know off the hand if non-competes are enforceable in Virginia?
Off the top of my head, no. I
Yeah.
would look it up.
Okay. All right. Another question. This one from Dan Katz. Thanks for writing in a question. It always makes these Facebook Lives more fun when they're actually live on both sides. Sort of a similar topic, but how are we expected to buy in for a partnership track after a few years? We've only really been making a solid salary for a few years and may have to take out a loan to buy into the practice. Any comments on buy-ins and how
Yeah.
they're structured and whether you think that's fair?
How fair it is depends on the return on investment. Like any other investment, if you're buying into a business, you should assume that you're going to get some type of increased compensation. So you'd want to look at that. How practices handle them is different. Sometimes they will discount your compensation for the first 2 or 3 years, and they treat that as your buy-in. So instead of paying you $300,000, they pay you $200,000, and you've over 3 years you paid in $300,000. That's your buy-in. Sometimes they will have internal financing after the fact, so you make 80% of what the other partners make until your buy-in is taken care of. Or the third option is to have some type of third-party lending. They'll have relationships with local banks where you can go out and get this loan. I think all of those happen. I think it just depends on what your group wants to do.
Yeah. I think in a field like emergency medicine where you're not buying into much, you're only buying into the accounts receivable.
Right.
It's usually sweat equity. You work for less for 2 years. But if you're going to own a piece of a $1.5 million office building and $700,000 worth of medical equipment, it seems a little more reasonable to maybe make you put up some cash.
Right.
But I've seen all kinds of weird loan terms. You get the loan from the practice. They've set something up with the bank on the side for you, and you have to use that bank. Or
Yeah.
I've seen some weird stuff in that department. It's really pretty variable.
Yeah.
Okay. The next question comes from Vlad. Can things like personal hardship, such as moving kids out of a school system due to having to leave a certain area, be a way out of a non-compete?
No, I don't.
It's pretty cut and dried, huh?
Yeah. They don't care about your kids, unfortunately. The ways you can invalidate or have a court rule in your favor in a non-compete is to show that it's one, it's unreasonable, that you can't find reasonable work, right, and support yourself or your family, right, with the terms that they're given, or it's a violation of public policy. And so your kids being in school, I don't think qualify under either of those. There's probably good school, unless, here's the one caveat. Maybe if your child has special needs or something and there's no other school that they can go to, but even that I think is a stretch.
Yeah, because you could always drive them to the school, I suppose.
Right.
He says, thanks, I tried. Yep, you did try, Vlad, but
Right.
that one's not going to fly.
Yeah,
all right, I'm down to our last question here. So if you have more questions, get them in. This one is from Tushar Patel. Boy, you guys, I am having trouble with names tonight. I hope I'm close. Is fair market value accurate when we mismatch in demand and supply of physicians since it is based on historical data? Or does one account for fair market value in our current environment? Also, how does a physician or group account for inflation and cost of living adjustments in contracts?
Great question. So all of the data that you look at, and this is true of any data set, right, it's always dated. It's always from the year before. So when MGMA comes out, for example, it comes out in end of May, early June usually. That's all based on 2020 data, right? So the 2021 report is based on 2020 data. The only way to know what fair market value is at the exact time you're signing a contract is to have other offers in your hand. That's live information, right? Cost of living we talked about, you can bake that into contracts. You can ask them for a 3, 4, 5% increase every year. You can also ask them to match the newest data that's out, right? So if MGMA goes up 5 or 6%, you ask them to match that every year. You probably want to think about being careful on that though too, because sometimes it does go down as well. You need to be able to live with that both ways if you really wanted to tie your comp completely to a survey.
Okay, I think you answered that whole question. All right, I think I am out of questions here. I'm not seeing more coming in here on Facebook, so I want to thank everyone who participated today. We've still got 36 of you on live, and some have been coming and going. This will be posted live later, so if you missed some of it, you can come back and get the rest, or not posted live, but it'll be posted in the group as soon as this is over. It'll also be prettied up and put on YouTube. If you need help, if you got specific questions, you need someone to negotiate for you, you just want someone to look over your contract, Kyle can do that. whitecoatinvestor.com/resolve will get you to their landing page. You can sign up. It's quick, it's easy. It will cost you a few $100s, but it's going to potentially save you a lot of hassle, a lot of headache, and maybe tens of thousands of dollars, depending on what crazy things are in your contract that you can get out of it using Kyle's services. Kyle, thank you for your time tonight. Oh, you always get two more at the end. This always happens, Okay, let's get these questions in. That's the whole point, is to do these live questions. This one from Ronald Tilley. Do you know the percentage of ownership allowed if a physician is doing a joint venture with a hospital in an ASC, a surgical center? Is a joint venture allowed in an HOPD, a hospital outpatient department?
And so the joint ventures that we see, it's usually around that 50-50 mark, depending on how they're structured. I think that's going to vary based on which state you're in and how it's, what the legal structure of it is. But the answer is yes. I mean, that's a very case specific and a very important question. So I would say you need to have that reviewed and looked at by, somebody that deals with those types of joint ventures all the time.
Okay. And another question from Mustafa: Is COVID year will affect your negotiation? I think he's asking how COVID and all the crazy things that have happened in the last 18 months, how should that affect your negotiation?
So the one thing that I think you should be careful of, right, is that if your specialty was affected negatively from COVID last year in 2020, that data is going to look a little bit worse in this survey, right? So if they shut down elective procedures, for example, the new data may be lower than what it was in 2019. So you may want to look at 3 or 4 years of data rather than just 1 year to beat that, that outlier. The other thing that I'd tell you too is that this is a very COVID specific contract clause. We're seeing a lot of force majeure clauses now, which basically mean that if COVID or pandemic or any other act of God happens, that the employer is able to just change and modify the contract instantly. They don't have to give you any notice on that. That was in 0 contracts before COVID, and now it's in almost every single contract because they're learning their lesson. I don't like that. None of you should like that. If somebody's going to change your contract, you should have some time to evaluate that or decide to move on. They shouldn't just be able to change your comp, tomorrow if they want to.
Yeah, those are common outside of physician employment agreements. I mean,
Right.
basically, as we go to lock down hotels for WCICon every year, those contracts have all changed, and they have specific items in there about pandemics and what we can cancel that contract for. But prior to the pandemic, all there was this broad force majeure clause that you had to interpret, and potentially go to court over. So I'm not surprised to see those creeping into physician employment contracts as well. Okay, that's all we've got. Thank you for tuning in today, and you can check the rest of this out. It will be posted shortly in the group.
My dad, your host, Dr. Dahle, is a practicing emergency physician, blogger, author, and podcaster. He is not a licensed accountant, attorney, or financial advisor, so this podcast is for your entertainment and information only and should not be considered official, personalized financial advice.